Turkish Airlines ranks as one of the largest European airlines with service to the United States, and the largest airline in this regard from the Middle East. With 14 cities currently served in the US, Turkish continues to bolster service to existing cities and is also eyeing new ones like Minneapolis, Philadelphia, Charlotte, and Orlando. And given Turkish's impressive resume as the world's largest airline by number of countries served, it's no wonder the airline manages to find success rather easily. Today, we're flying from Turkish's mega hub in Istanbul across to Chicago, one of the busiest routes that the airline operates to the US. We'll be on board the 777-300ER, an aircraft that has served as the backbone of Turkish's long-haul operations for well over a decade. Aside from the onboard service, you'll get to see the connecting experience in Istanbul's massive new airport, along with the arrival process in the US. With that said, I hope you'll enjoy the journey, and let's get started. Günaydın or good morning from Istanbul, where I've just landed from Jeddah, the subject of an earlier video, and am now proceeding to transit security. The vast majority of international arrivals in Istanbul must clear transit security, except for those arriving from the US, Canada, the UK, and EU member nations. Now, because I am arriving from Saudi Arabia, I do have to clear security. Now, you're going to hear this over and over again, but Istanbul Airport is massive, and it was around 10 to 15 minutes just to walk from the far end of Concourse B to the transit security checkpoint in the main terminal. Thankfully, the whole security process was just 20 minutes, but I can imagine the waiting times could be much longer. After clearing transit security, you head upstairs and enter the main terminal's atrium, which is where you'll find most of the shops, dining options, and lounges. Istanbul Airport has 5 actual concourses, and then the main terminal itself has 4 C gates and another 4 E gates. Istanbul is a true global hub, serving just under 80 million passengers in 2024. This is primarily thanks to hometown carrier Turkish Airlines, serving the most countries of any airline, a number that currently stands at 129 countries and 340 destinations in total. I had a decently long layover in Istanbul at around 4 to 5 hours. Now, given Istanbul is an amazing airport for plane spotting, I decided to head back to Concourse B and spend some time at an empty gate watching all the aircraft. Now, Turkey is not an official member of the European Union, meaning that its aviation laws aren't as strict as the EU member states. This means that multiple airlines from sanctioned countries like Iran, Russia, and Libya operate multiple services to Istanbul from various cities because it's the only place that they're allowed to fly to in mainland Europe. And as a matter of fact, this airport is indeed located on the European side of Istanbul. Now, unfortunately, my phone was basically out of charge by this point, and I found it really hard to find good charging points in the airport, though I was able to find a charging station in the basement gate area. It's also worth mentioning that while there is free Wi-Fi, I also found it really unreliable and frustrating to use. This afternoon, we're on board Turkish Flight 5 to Chicago. It's my second time on this flight, having last flown it in 2014. Turkish began service to Chicago in 1997 with the Airbus A340-300. It was the airline's second US destination following New York JFK. And as a fun fact, when I last took this flight in 2014, it was operated by the A330-200, and back then, that was the longest A330 route in the world. Our flight departs from gate D13, the same gate I arrived at from Chicago a few days earlier. Concourse D is the primary departure point for US flights, as most gates have secondary checkpoints, as you'd normally find for US-bound international flights. But the setup here in Istanbul is a little different. All passengers have their passports and boarding passes checked before entering the gate area, but not everyone passes through secondary screening. And it's not even a proper checkpoint like you'd expect. It's just a little station where an officer will go through your bag only if the agent checking your passport thinks you need another bag search. Thankfully, I didn't have to experience this, but one of my friends did, and from what I saw, it wasn't even that bad of a check. Our aircraft finally pulled up from the hangar about 55 minutes before departure time, and given this 777 still had to be fully serviced, there's no way we'd be getting out on time. Turkish names its aircraft after cities or geographical features in Turkey, and our aircraft is named Çukurova, which is the Turkish name for the Cilician plain that spans a large part of southern Turkey. In the weeks leading up to this flight, TK5's on-time performance had been absolutely horrendous. Almost every day, this flight was departing Istanbul with an average delay of 2 to 3 hours, and I could never figure out why. By the time our 3:40 p.m. departure time rolled around, the aircraft was still being serviced. But still, I wasn't expecting a massive delay, and sure enough, we began boarding around 30 minutes later. Turkish boards its economy class passengers from back to front, and the boarding process was somewhat of organized chaos, slow at first, but it cleared up on the final stretch towards the aircraft. Turkish operates a fleet of 34 777-300ERs, the vast majority of which have 349 seats, with 49 in business class with a 232 configuration and 300 in economy, thankfully still retaining a 333 configuration compared to most 777 operators these days who have a 343. Turkish also has 3 former Kenya Airways 777-300ERs with 400 seats, but these mainly serve routes like London, Dubai, Delhi, Mumbai, and busy domestic routes. And side note, the 2 777s that currently fly for Indigo are wet leased from Turkish Airlines as part of an agreement, and these have 531 seats. Those 777s fly solely between Mumbai and Delhi to Istanbul, and apparently Indigo was supposed to get rid of the 777s sometime last year, but I guess that never happened. My seat is 14K, and overall the seats were comfortable with leather headrests and soft fabric with good padding. Turkish's older 777s with the JJ registrations have these older video monitors, but regardless they're adjustable, and my screen was pretty responsive. Remote controls are also present as a plan B. Also present is a coat hook along with USB and Ethernet ports. Next is the tray table, seat pocket, and 31 inches of pitch, which is average. Not fun by any means, but definitely tolerable for 11 hours. Below the seats are footrests and also power outlets, which I didn't realize until later on in the flight. And the worst part about Turkish's 777s is that they, I can't believe I'm saying this, do not have personal air vents. Waiting on the seats upon boarding are complimentary pillows, blankets, headsets, and also amenity kits, which we'll take a look at later in the flight. Now, one memory I have of Turkish from 2014 is that pre-departure passengers were offered Turkish delights from the onboard chefs, but that practice seems to have sadly been eliminated.
Koruyucu bir maskenizi ve varsa bir sinyalinizi çıkarın. Oksijen maskesini ağız ve burnunuzun içine alacak şekilde yüzünüze yerleştirin.
if there's one row to avoid on the Turkish 777, it's right here in row 14 because of the misaligned windows. I originally booked seat 16A for $70, but ended up moving here so that a family could sit together. Not the most ideal situation, but at least we have a window. As I've covered before, Turkish's entertainment system is fantastic with endless options for content and also great resources for flight information, including an interactive map. Also available are games, podcasts, Islamic content, and travel-related content, among others. The amenity kits received on this flight were completely different to the ones on my Chicago-Istanbul flight 10 days earlier. These kits were made by Mandarina Duck and had all the basic essentials like toothbrush and toothpaste, earplugs, eye shades, and socks and slippers, both of which were way too small, not just for me, but I assume other passengers as well. The headsets offered are also pretty basic, but offer good sound quality, and I appreciate Turkish offering actual proper headphones as opposed to tiny earphones that you might find on other airlines. Another detail of Turkish that I love is the presence of menus in economy class on long-haul flights. These are distributed right before the first meal service and list all of the available food and drink options on board your flight. Of the two late lunch choices, I went with the grilled fillet of salmon and cherry juice. This was served with tomatoes and mozzarella, hummus, chocolate mousse for dessert, and the salmon itself was alongside celery mousseline and sautéed zucchini. Bread rolls were also handed out separately. Now, across my 4 flights on Turkish this trip, this flight easily had the best food. Everything was delicious, especially the salmon, and I always appreciate the metal cutlery and sanitizing wipes provided as well. TK5 is scheduled to depart Istanbul around 4 p.m. and arrive in Chicago just after 6 p.m. This means that during the spring and summer, the flight is entirely in daylight, but in the fall and winter, the days are shorter, so it races the sunset at first. I took this flight in January, so after a few hours, the sun eventually won, and the majority of the flight was spent in darkness. Water bottles were passed out sometime after the first meal service, which I really appreciate as it's important to stay hydrated on these long flights. By this point, the sun had completely set and the cabin was fully dark. We were flying directly over Scotland, and this was when I decided to take my first nap. I woke up 2.5 hours later, right as we were passing Greenland. And this is when I noticed that the Inflight map actually has a feature for Muslim passengers where they can check the prayer times for various cities and also the direction of Mecca. I soon decided to get up and take a walk around the cabin. I went to one of the rear lavatories and it was still in good shape. I really like how Turkish offers cologne and moisturizers in the economy bathrooms, and also the fact that the waste bin is controlled by a foot lever so you don't have to touch anything with your hands. Now, of course, it's dark so you can't really see anything, but as usual for a Turkish Airlines flight to Chicago, this flight was completely full. I later returned to my seat and fell asleep for probably another 5 hours until the pre-landing meal service began. Now, this was a tough choice. It was either red pepper chicken or gnocchi. I ended up going for the gnocchi, which was served with some sort of salad, cheesecake, and a bread roll, and the gnocchi itself was alongside fried eggplants in a tomato sauce. Once again, I had cherry juice to drink. And as usual, the meal was delicious, and especially the dessert. This flight easily takes the cake for the best economy class food I've ever had. By this point, we were back over North America and flying over Canada. The last 2 hours I spent watching Ford vs. Ferrari, actually such a solid movie, and I was barely able to finish it because soon enough we were closing in on Chicago. Now, if you've ever flown internationally into the US before, you might recall that normally there's a video played regarding the customs and immigration process. But this was the first flight that I've been on where no such video was played. Our approach brought us in from the north, interestingly enough, directly overflying Milwaukee and Chicago's northwest suburbs before passing north of O'Hare and making a 180 over Lake Michigan. We then came and passed downtown as usual for landing on runway 27 Center. So as we fly past O'Hare on downwind, this is a good time to talk about just how important Chicago is for Turkish Airlines. Turkish has served the city for almost 28 years now, and pre-pandemic, the airline's flights from Chicago had an average seat load factor of 92%, the highest of any US destination at the time. Turkish added a second daily flight to Chicago in 2021, which continues to operate today in the morning, while this flight continues to operate in the evening. Between July and October 2025, Turkish will add a third flight to Chicago, operating 3 times per week, increasing its weekly flights to 17. Now, of course, there's not this much demand solely between Chicago and Istanbul to justify so many flights. Of course, Turkish has an insane global reach, serving the most countries of any airline. And similarly, Chicago and Illinois overall are very diverse, with large Eastern European, Middle Eastern, West African, and South Asian populations, among other ethnic groups. Therefore, most passengers flying Turkish are connecting in Istanbul elsewhere, with the most popular destinations being the likes of Karachi, Pakistan, Athens, Greece, Ankara, Turkey, Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, Lahore, Pakistan, Skopje, North Macedonia, Chisinau, Moldova, Mumbai, India, and Cairo in Egypt. That's a very diverse range of world cities and just goes to show the insane global reach that Turkish has. And one more thing, here's O'Hare's top 10 international destinations between 2022 and 2023. Istanbul is the only route on this list with a monopoly, and in fact, O'Hare is one of only 2 US airports where Istanbul ranks in its top 10 international destinations, the other one being Washington Dulles. As I've mentioned throughout this series, my flights on this trip were booked as part of an Umrah package to Saudi Arabia that included hotels, transportation, and other activities. I was honestly surprised at just how much I slept on this flight, but then again, I had barely slept the night before leaving Saudi Arabia. The overall flight was great, with delicious food, a good seat, and a nice crew. I will say that the only part of the whole Turkish Airlines experience that I didn't particularly like, and this is true for other airlines as well, is having to pay to pre-book your seat in economy. As mentioned earlier, I paid about $70 for my seat, which makes sense given it's one of the first few rows of economy class. Most other economy class seats towards the back were around $35. But not a big deal, and I specifically chose a seat in the forward economy cabin just so I could be among the first economy class passengers off the plane. We're arriving during the evening international rush period in Chicago alongside flights from Lufthansa, British Airways, EVA, and so many others. And given I don't currently have global entry, I wanted to see how much I could minimize my time in immigration. Now, of course, I have to mention that this trip was January 2025. The entire international travel situation into the US has changed dramatically since then, especially for non-US citizens. Unfortunately, I can't speak on the current situation, but if you are traveling internationally from the US very soon, make sure you read up on good practices to consider when returning to the United States. So surprisingly, I was only in the customs line for about 30 minutes before a quick 30-second or so meeting with the officer, and then I was out in baggage claim. And that brings us to the end of this incredible journey to Saudi Arabia. Thank you so much for joining me on this series, and I hope you enjoyed it. Any feedback is appreciated, but now I've got a 2-hour drive back home, which I'm absolutely dreading. Until next time, take care everyone, and I will see you all again very soon.